What is the point of the pursuit of power? The answer that George Orwell gives us in 1984 is unlike the reasons presented in other dystopian books. The party and O'Brien do not believe in the pursuit of power for the betterment of society. For them, power is pursued for power's sake. The ends become the means, and there is nothing greater than the thrill of exacting power over another human being. And if the philosophical driving force behind the party's belief is that the power one holds over another is paramount, there is just one thing that is strange about this book: the misogyny. Stay with me, I promise I will explain. The difficulty of reading gender in 1984 comes from the fact that as readers, we are unable to determine whether Winston's misogyny is being written as a part of the world Orwell wants us to reject, or is simply something that is being reproduced by the narrative itself. And is this even the case, or is it all intentional? In order to understand Winston and Julia's relationship, we first have to look at Winston and O'Brien. O'Brien defines the power he seeks not as a mindless passive obedience, but by a person obeying despite being made to suffer. Essentially, the party treats power as a game with rules and steps that allow one to get the upper hand or lower hand depending on what they do. O'Brien and Winston are at odds in this game throughout the entire novel. Winston wants to break free from the party, and O'Brien wants to subsume Winston into it. To O'Brien, mindless obedience is unfun. When there's no resistance to his power, there is no game. His power is part of the structured system, and it's only when his opponent resists and fights for what they believe in that there is any enjoyment to be had from playing the game. The act of crushing your opponent and relishing in the power of making him obey while he suffers. It's because O'Brien is completely sold on the idea of power for power's sake that he dislikes an easy win. Where was the fun in winning against Winston if he wasn't fully converted as a rebel? This is why O'Brien feeds Winston the fake brotherhood and Goldstein's book. He intends to solidify Winston's beliefs so that the joy he'll extract from crushing him will be worth the game of power. To him, and to the party, the height of satisfaction from power comes not from dominating the body, but by dominating the mind. But what happens when the opponent in the game isn't Winston, but Julia? Unlike Winston, Julia is not presented to us as interested in the politics of the party. Nor does she show any interest in Goldstein's book or understanding the truth behind why the party does what it does. She's purely practical and is concerned, it would seem, entirely with herself. Her rebellion is only concerned with her ability to have sex and wear perfume and makeup. Winston concludes that Julia is, quote, only a rebel from the waist downwards. Of course, we must ask ourselves, why does Winston get to define what counts as a valid act of rebellion against the party? Especially when the party itself is deeply concerned with the sexual politics of its society. In the appendix, written by an anonymous narrator in the distant future of the in-book universe, the following definition of a newspeak term is provided. Quote, an ordinary citizen knew what was meant by good sex. That is to say, normal intercourse between man and wife, for the sole purpose of begetting children and without physical pleasure on the part of the woman. All else was sex crime. The party concerns itself with sex, marriage. It makes it a point to marry individuals who do not seem sexually attracted to one another, and it intends to eradicate any pleasure one could derive from sex. The party has made sexuality political, and so Julia's sexual rebellion does not occur outside of the politics of 1984. So let us consider for a moment that Winston is right, and that Julia doesn't really care about anything other than herself. That, quote, everything came back to her own sexuality. Why then does the novel treat Winston's intention to understand the party's motivations on oppression as more important than Julia's desire to live outside it? Well, maybe the novel doesn't really treat one character's motivations as better than the other. Perhaps Winston's intention is to understand the machinations behind the party's regime, and Julia simply wants the regime to stop dictating her life. Maybe both approaches are fine. Then we ask ourselves just how much of Julia are we able to see in this novel? When Winston first encounters Julia, he thinks to himself that she's young and pretty. He thinks, quote, he hated her because she was young and pretty and sexless, because he wanted to go to bed with her and would never do so, because around her sweet supple waist, which seemed to ask you to encircle it with your arm, there was only the odious scarlet sash. aggressive symbol of chastity. He then thinks he'd like to rape and kill her. She's a young, beautiful woman, and he cannot have her because she must remain chaste, and that enrages him. Later on, after being approached by Julia, he dreams of her throwing her clothes aside, and he says, quote, "As though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept away into nothingness by a single splendid movement of the arm." And later on, when they are intimate, he feels like his first time having sex with Julia is not an act of love or even desire for a woman. It was purely a political act. It is through Julia's body that Winston seeks out to act his own political rebellion. She's first an idea before she's a person, and their relationship is first political before it is intimate. He believes himself entitled to Julia, hence why her chastity angers him. He thinks he's being denied her body, a body that otherwise would have submitted to him. He tells himself he loves her, but he knows nothing about her. Finally, when Julia cannot meet him when she's on her period, Winston is for a moment violently angry, and thinks to himself that, quote, she had become a physical necessity, something that he not only wanted but felt he had a right to. And so it would seem that Julia is purely objectified in this narrative. But then we realize that she was the one who approached him. She approaches him first with her secret "I love you" letter. She sets up their meetings, brings him chocolate, declares her love and calls him dear, and takes the initiative sexually. And the reader might ask themselves, why? Winston is a middle-aged, unhealthy man with his varicose ulcer, which is mentioned more times than I think should ever be mentioned in one book. He's anxious, boring, and unimportant. On the other hand, Julia is attractive, young, confident, and resourceful. Despite these differences in their characters, she is the one who, out of nowhere and at a huge risk to herself, declares her love for this miserable worm. There are a few plausible reasons Julia might have purposely gone after unappealing men as an act of rebellion against the party's regime, or Julia's pursuit of Winston is a setup to force him to reevaluate his own philosophy, or this secret, funny third option in which Orwell is constructing the male fantasy where improbably a younger, hotter woman falls in love with and pursues an older, miserable man. This uncertainty in why Julia acts the way she does leaves room for so much interpretation, which is also where a lot of my issue lies. One could even argue that Julia is a product of her environment. She seeks out Winston not because she's attracted to him, but because she wants to be sexually free regardless of who she is free with. She says she wants to be a real woman, not a party comrade. She will wear makeup and perfume and high heels. Naively, she thinks that becoming more feminine will rid her of all her issues. Of course, this is not real liberation. The party woman and Julia are two ends of the patriarchal pendulum. One is chaste and obedient, the other sexual and rebellious. Just because the party tells everyone that their bodies belong to the state does not mean that by physically reclaiming them through intimate acts that they are liberated. In this case, has this novel inverted the sexual restrictions imposed by the party without questioning why women's bodies are always the primary vehicle for them to express their freedom? Or am I just thinking about this too much? In a scene where both of them speak to O'Brien about rebellion, Julia, despite being a rebel just like Winston, is rarely given any direct attention from either of the characters. It is in this scene that we see how the men are willing to converse with one another and speak on the behalf of Julia. It is only when O'Brien suggests that they should separate from each other that Julia breaks in to say no. Only then are the two men reminded of her existence. Winston even hesitates. He doesn't know what he wants to say, but ultimately he agrees with her. So why was Julia so othered? Can a game of power not exist with 3 people? Or 4? Or even 5? Or is it partly because the regime itself does not see women as people, doubly so because Winston does not see Julia as a person? Winston and O'Brien, products of their ultra-sexist society, play the game of power where Julia is not needed to speak, and when she does, she disturbs their play. Here I wonder if Orwell is deliberately showing us the way men in this society exclude women, or if the novel has simply reproduced this exclusion. Why does the narrative then not interrogate Winston's misogyny? The novel presents to us the dangers of allowing the party, Big Brother, to determine reality for people. But what about Winston determining Julia for us? Does the novel ever give us evidence that Winston has maybe misinterpreted Julia? Julia, in the eyes of Winston, is a childish, narrow-minded, and sex-concerned woman. And as the readers, we have no reason to believe otherwise, until she reveals at the end of the book that she too was forced under extreme torture to betray him in room 101. In this brief instance, the narrative allows us a glimpse into Julia's interiority that Winston was unable to access throughout the novel. But that's all we get, a brief glimpse, that maybe he was wrong about her all along. But that doesn't matter because the narrative doesn't follow that brief glimpse anywhere. I think when we zoom out and we look at Catherine, Winston's mother, the prole woman, the prostitute, it might be a smarter guess to just assume that Orwell has a tendency to make his characters represent ideas rather than allow them to be fully fledged characters. And that is ultimately where I tend to get stuck with Julia as a character. Winston starts the novel believing the party controls history. Then he believes the party is lying and even begins to believe O'Brien is some secret ally. The novel then deconstructs these beliefs and rejustifies the party's mantra. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. But when it comes to Julia, Winston believes her to be shallow and sexual and, well, maybe she isn't. We don't really know. I can find evidence that Orwell deliberately wants us to distrust Winston's understanding of her, but I can also find evidence that the novel reproduces the very assumptions that Winston holds about her. Her interiority is limited, and her sexuality dominates her characterization. How much of 1984 was criticizing Winston's worldview, rather than simply showing it to us? And did this novel successfully criticize a system of power while remaining blind to the other systems embedded within its own narrative? In a novel that teaches us to question every structure of power, history, language, sexuality, and even reality itself, it leaves surprisingly little space to question the gendered assumptions through which its own protagonist understands women. O'Brien understands Winston better than Winston understands himself. Winston is simultaneously understood by O'Brien and believes he understands Julia. But when it comes to Julia, she is left almost entirely inaccessible to us. For a novel so obsessed with the power to define another person's reality, this is a pretty strange omission, and I genuinely don't know whether it was intentional. And as Margaret Atwood put it, dystopia's women are either sexless automatons or rebels who defy the sex rules of the regime.